Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us today. My name is Chelsea Domenico, and I'd like to welcome you to our webcast focused on insights and trends for the 2018 World's Most Ethical Companies. Over the next hour, you'll hear Erica and Doug dive into what we've learned from the 2018 honorees. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage question and answers, and we'd love to make this as engaging as possible to be more of a conversation with you today. So please use the chat or questions feature you see in your webcasting platform, and we'll try to answer as many questions as they come up. But if we do happen to run out of time, we'll follow up with you via email. Following the live webcast, we'll be sending you a few items today, including the recording of today's presentation materials, the PowerPoint you see here, and the latest research report from our 2018 WMEs. Before I turn the floor over, I'd like to quickly introduce to you my colleagues at Ethisphere who will be leading today's conversation, which is Douglas Allen, Director of Data and Advisory Services with Ethisphere, as well as my colleague Erica Salmon-Byrne, Executive Vice President, and she will be kicking things off today. So Erica, I will leave you to share the agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chelsea, and I will add my welcome to yours. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a tremendous group of people who have registered and are slowly logging into today's webcast, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to spend an hour with you talking about what we are seeing from a trend perspective. As Chelsea mentioned, I am EVP here at the Ethisphere Institute, and I have been joined by my colleague, Doug Allen. I'll ask Doug to say a quick hello, and then we'll dive straight into the content for today.
Thank you, Erica. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. As Erica did mention, I am Douglas Allen, Director within the Data and Services Group. Very happy to be here and happy to be joining you, Erica, in discussing some of the insights we found from this year's World's Most Ethical Companies data.
Wonderful. So a couple of quick words on the agenda. And once again, I would like to encourage, as Chelsea mentioned, we do try, for those of you who have been on one of our webcasts in the past, we really try to make these as interactive and engaging as the digital or virtual format allows them to be. So please do send questions in to Doug and I. I interrupt myself with questions. I will interrupt Doug with questions as they pertain to the material that we're working our way through. And then there are a couple of questions that we got submitted in advance of the presentation, and we'll make sure to weave those in or address those when we get to the end, assuming that we have a little bit of leftover time. A couple of quick words on the agenda. So first, we're going to set the stage for those of you on the line who are not as familiar with the work that we do here, and particularly the data sets that we'll be referencing over the course of the hour that we have together. So we'll spend just a couple minutes setting the stage. Then we're going to move into the three kind of big buckets that Doug and I found most interesting in the data. Insights from a programmatic perspective in terms of how WME companies are structuring their ethics and compliance programs. There was a lot of movement and interesting trends from a culture perspective, and culture is a topic that we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about here at Ethisphere. And then talking briefly about different ways in which we see companies moving the ball on engaging the board of directors. And then, as I said, we'll take whatever questions are left that we have time for at the end there. So setting the stage a little bit for those of you on the phone who are not quite as familiar with Ethisphere as others may be, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on the next slide talking about what we do. So Ethisphere as an organization has been around for just about 12 years now, and we see ourselves as occupying a space where we get to celebrate companies that do the right thing. So we use our EQ survey, which we have been developing over the course of the last 10 years with the help of a variety of experts in the community. We use that to give companies the opportunity to objectively measure their program and look at the ways in which they might potentially improve it going forward. We also take very seriously the idea that there is no competition in compliance, and if somebody has worked out the best way to deal with a particular issue, it's our responsibility to share that. So whether it's through our roundtables, our conferences, our magazine, our thought leadership, our podcast series, webcasts like this, we try our best to share whatever we see companies doing well across our community, and then recognizing those that really stand out. So whether it's, again, through the World's Most Ethical Companies process or through some of our other mechanisms for thought leadership, celebrating the things that companies do very well and giving you all the opportunity to get some positive press, positive attention for the advancements that you've made in your program. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Doug, who's going to talk a little bit more about specifically our data and the way we think about the way we think about data here at Ethisphere, and then we'll dive into what we see in the data set itself.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. So Erica had mentioned a little bit about what Ethisphere does and how we do really grounded in data. And really everything we do is, again, grounded in that foundation of evidence-based data that drive the standards forward. And really our largest and most, in my opinion, impactful measurement effort is what alluded to is our ethics quotient process, or ethics quotient survey. An ethics quotient, for those of you who have not had a chance to see it, is an extensive questionnaire we update on an annual basis that looks to measure the current state of information compliance and ethics efforts, governance practices, how that organization is measuring culture, as well as corporate social responsibility and citizenship efforts, and leadership, innovation, and reputation. And this ethics quotient process really underlies all of the value services that Ethisphere provides as well. So of course, with benchmarking and scorecards, as well as program assessments, that data is foundational to conducting those. But also it grounds our world's most ethical companies process. Those agents that perform the best within the context of EQ are the organizations we recognize. And so we get asked all the time, why does Ethisphere need to exist? Why do you do what you do? And really the reason why we do this is we believe measuring ethics in those organizations that exhibit ethical behavior the best way is a substantial differentiator. On the next slide, Chelsea, if you can move the presentation, we have, on an annual basis, we choose companies that we recognize as the world's most ethical and look to see how they perform against a comparable risk-adjusted index. And year after year, the world's most ethical companies outperform to a pretty substantial degree a comparable index. Here we have for last year about a 5% premium over a 3-year time span for those recognized versus those who are not. And that actually increases over time. If you look at it across a 5-year time span, that approaches 10%. So again, measuring this matters, and the evidence is here in terms of why we do what we do. So for the purposes of today, we'll do a little bit of stage setting, as Erica alluded to, and discussing who are these companies that comprise the world's most ethical companies grouping. So for the class of 2018, we have a variety of organizations. We recognized 135 organizations across 23 different countries, and 50 independent sectors. We have a little bit of breakdown in for you here. This is to provide you all with the context in terms of where our findings and insights come from, and to give you, again, some additional text on who is comprising this group. You'll also notice today that because Ethisphere really lives and dies by data in everything we do, we'll be interjecting several different data sets that Ethisphere's collected throughout today's presentation. So you'll hear references by Erica and I to our culture data set, our root cause, and others. So again, everything we do is grounded in data in terms of exploring these insights. So with that background and that context, Erica, I'll turn it back over to you to discuss our first substantive topic, which is training and reporting. Erica?
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. And thank you for those of you who chatted in or sent in questions indicating that Doug's audio was a little choppy there. We're going to try to fix that while I set the stage and see if we can't get that covered so that you all can hear Doug more clearly as he moves as we move into the insights themselves. So as I mentioned, when we sit down at the end of each year's annual review process and we look over the data that we've collected as part of the EQ analysis, those of you who have been through the ethics quotient, it's an enormous survey. Well north of 200 questions the average company answers. And so there are a lot of different insights that we could potentially pull out of it. And we spend a fair amount of time thinking about what we find most interesting in the data. And so what Doug and I are going to share with you all today is sort of 3 main buckets of things that we found most interesting. And we wanted to start with this program insights section. And the idea here is that, we pulled out the training and reporting component because these are 2 cornerstones of an effective ethics and compliance program. I like to say that they're, that the purpose of an ethics and compliance program is really to mitigate people-created risk. And at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is make sure that all of your employees understand what's expected of them and that they'll raise their hand and tell you when something goes wrong. And so each one of these pieces is really fitting into to that concept, right? Training managers to become cultural standard banners, and we'll tell you why, right? In terms of why that's important. The different ways in which the managers, world's most ethical companies rather, are accessing their managers and utilizing their managers is a really critical piece of it. So the first piece that we're going to dive into, and Doug, I'll see if your audio is any better. The first piece we're going to dive into is really this question of how are companies making sure that their managers are equipped to be what they need to be. So Doug, are you back with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Oh, it's so much better. Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. So Doug, I'm going to let you take the first stab at this particular slide and just talk a little bit about what we saw in the data on the question of manager training.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. And again, apologies to the group for the audio problems experienced earlier. And thank you to everyone who chimed in. Regarding training managers, of course, it's, as we'll allude to in just a few slides, the importance of training managers is fundamental. We're finding over time that there's a small but steady increase in the amount of organizations who are in fact training managers. And the reason why it's so important is the extent to which we're finding managers being used as a reporting resource. Chelsea, if you don't mind backing up one more slide, we'll touch on this momentarily. Between 2015 and 2018, we see a small but steady increase in the number of organizations actually implementing training specific to managers. And the topics covered are broad and wide. You'll see on the right several topics with respect to what is included in that manager training. Covers things such as encouraging employees to speak up, promoting a culture of compliance and ethics, as well as creating and maintaining an open door environment. And Erica, what's not shown here that we have seen before is that with regards to incorporating ethics in business decision making, you see 94% here in the slide. We've seen a 10% jump in that number over the last few years. I'm curious to see what comes to mind when you see such a pretty dramatic jump, and that is the largest jump we've seen with respect to the topics included in training over these last few years.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point, Doug. And part of the reason, one of the things that I think is underpinning that particular data jump based on the conversations that I've had with companies over the last couple of years is a growing recognition that simply asking managers to deliver ethics-related messaging is not as effective as we'd like it to be, right? We've all sat in those meetings where we have the ethics moment, and of course I'm webcasting so you guys can't see it, but I'm air quoting ethics moment, right? And you know, it's the let's have the ethics moment, and then we're going to go back and talk about the business, right? And the piece, the reason why that matters so much is that it separates out the idea of doing business the right way from the business, and that's not the point. What you want is to have a conversation with managers about making decisions out loud, right? Talk through your process, engage your direct reports in a conversation about the ways in which you're using company values and company decisions to really be able to move the ball forward. That's how you take a concept like conflicts of interest and translate it into the way in which business is done in your particular procurement group. It's the bridge, it's the pivot point that is so critical. And that's the reason and more we're seeing companies just have that conversation with their managers, right? Have that conversation with people who are in leadership roles, are ethical role models for the business as a really critical piece of disseminating the program across the organization.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And so we featured here, Erica, too, some of the most common topics explored as part of this manager-specific training. What isn't shown here, though, is the fact that less than half, about 49% of organizations that were recognized for 2018, include topics specific to conducting employee interviews. So I know one thing you and I discuss quite often is the importance of hiring as that one of the levers you can pull to influence culture across the organization. So I'm curious, how do you interpret that fairly low, relatively speaking, percentage of organizations who do train their managers on the topic of interviews?
Yeah, and it's an interesting point, Doug, and it'll be interesting to see over the course of the next couple of years how that number moves. I think there are a couple of factors that are driving it. One is, in some organizations, I think there's a lack of recognition that managers have a role to play in hiring, right? There's a reliance on the recruitment function or the recruiting function to do a lot of the screening, and they're not necessarily thinking about the manager as a final arbiter of culture fit. But as you say, hiring is one of the key levers that you can pull on to influence a culture inside of an organization. We like to say here that it's who you hire, who you fire, and who you praise and promote. And if you don't look at that hiring piece, then there's an opportunity for a real miss or a real lapse, and hiring the wrong person from a culture fit perspective in particular can be so phenomenally expensive. So, yesterday I was on a webinar, I moderated a webinar where the VP of HR for Microsoft was one of my panel members, and he made the point that they're really thinking hard about what their key markers of culture are, and then having a conversation with their managers about how to hire and how to question people for those key culture markers. So if it's growth mindset, you might ask about an opportunity, what you learned from failure in a particular, give a very specific example of how you failed and what you learned from it. So I do think more and more companies are thinking about this. I suspect we'll see more and more companies start to have these conversations, but part of it goes down to one of the conversations, Doug, that you and I have a lot, which is the need for a really robust relationship between human resources and compliance, and the ways in which those conversations, sort of influence things like manager training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. Well, great. And so here we discuss quickly, what organizations are doing, but when it comes to why we're seeing this change, or at least this adoption of manager-specific training, on the next slide, Chelsea, if you could progress the presentation, we're finding that, and this should come as no surprise to most individuals on the line, that the manager is by far and away the most common reporting resource within an organization. And this data set right here, rather this question comes from Ethisphere's own Culture Quotient data set, where we've had a chance to survey dozens of organizations and collect responses from hundreds of thousands of individuals within those organizations to get a sense of their perceptions of the compliance and ethics program, as well as their perceptions of your overall organization's ethical culture. And here we find that about 68% of those individuals who say they did in fact see an instance of misconduct in the past 12 months and reported it, said they went to their immediate manager to make that report. What's interesting is that compares pretty dramatically to the 8% that use the hotline. So in a sense, for every one hotline call, you're getting about 8 or so questions to your managers from employees with questions or concerns regarding misconduct. 8 to 1 is that ratio. And what's really surprising here is how consistent that ratio is across organizations. There is some flexibility, but it's really an opportunity to look at your own program and say to yourself, what is my ratio between the well, first of all, are you even measuring this? Are you capturing, are the tools in place to even capture these types of reports? And if so, are you seeing a ratio similar to that 8 to 1 type concern?
Right. And if you're not, that's an opportunity to ask yourself, why not? Because that means either your managers aren't telling you when they get questions from employees, they're handling it themselves, or your managers aren't really handling the question, and instead that person either takes their question and goes away with it and you never hear of it again, or if they're particularly motivated, you might hear about it through one of these other reporting mechanisms. But that takes a fair level of commitment and courage to be able to do that. We got a great question that came in from the floor, 2 great questions actually that came in from the floor about on this particular slide. So the first is, Doug, we've seen a bit of an increase in the 18 months or so that we've been doing this work of the other category. What are some of the things that fall in other that you have seen that stand out?
That's a wonderful question. Other really it's other for a reason, right? We've developed this question specifically to capture as many different reporting resources as we can. This chart that you see in front of you is not representative of every option in the question set, but other really varies. And what I've found for other specifically are unique tools and resources that are very organization or industry specific.
Yep.
So
like Ombudsman.
Exactly. Ombudsman is very common. We've seen some organizations utilize different mobile applications in some instances. It's rare, but it does happen. Otherwise, there's different kind of unique functional specific reporting resources that are put in place. So it really does depend on the organization and how it's structured for what constitutes that other.
That's right, exactly. And for those of you who are wondering why the totals are more than 100%, this particular question, the way we get to it in the survey work that we do, first we ask, have you seen something over the last 12 months? Yes, no. Did you say something? Yes, no. And there's usually about a 50% drop off, FYI, between those who saw something and those who said something. And if you said something, who'd you say it to? And that is a multiple select. So again, as I mentioned, you have people who go to their manager first. If they don't get the support that they need, they will then go to somebody else. They'll go to HR, they'll go to their manager's manager, they'll call the helpline, they'll call the ethics and compliance office, they'll call the ombudsman, and they can select all of those options when they answer this question. So that's the reason why the math on this one is more than 100%.
Thank you for the clarification, Erica. And one other thing that I'll point out for this slide is you'll notice the top 4 non-other responses listed here are people, right? And just for a little bit of foreshadowing, what this tells us is people really want to speak to people. They have questions, they have concerns, they want to have that dialogue, and really the importance of making sure those individuals are trained properly and educated on how to handle these requests is fundamental to making sure that it's dealt with effectively.
Yep, absolutely. And then the last question that came in, Doug, before I'll move off this slide, is the difference between a reporting hotline and a web reporting tool. And so the difference there is basically, did you call somebody? Did you pick the phone up and call the hotline? Or did you use a online form to submit a particular question or concern? That's the difference between the two. That's right.
That's right.
And so the lesson here, not only looking at your own statistics and seeing, sort of where you fall, but the takeaway to Doug and I on this one is, as you think about where you put your time, your energy, and your resources, think about this tendency that the data shows us to go to a person. And so, if you have to choose between augmenting your web reporting tools and training your managers, you're going to get a better result. This data tells us out of training your managers, and particularly training your managers to tell you what kind of questions they're getting.
Yep,
so
I think that's right.
Yeah.
So this slide again touches on the why. We always continue to keep a close eye on how managers are being trained, but we often get the question of how. I mean, what do you do with respect to training managers? And the data we've seen with respect to ways leading companies engage and train managers is a few different things. First of which, Chelsea, if you'd like to progress the presentation slide, thank you. The first of which is when training managers don't simply leave it at training, but hold them accountable and track what they're doing. The vast majority, 86%, do in fact track completion rates for the manager training, and 2 out of 3 honorees make it mandatory. They enforce this training, they make sure it's done. So again, don't just train, but track and hold managers accountable to getting it done. And secondly, keep it fresh, right? Most honorees, 84%, indicate that they, at least every other year, update their manager-specific training. Make sure that it's relevant, it's well invested, and again, make sure the content contained therein is fresh. And then finally, do it while the managers are new. 78%, so again, a very strong majority of honorees are ensuring that this manager's training specific to their E&C responsibilities is done during the onboarding process. So get them as they enter the organization and before they've had a chance to really, let's say, adopt any sort of not unpreferred informal systems throughout the organization. So again, 3 key things that we've seen with respect to way leading companies engage and train managers.
Yeah. And Doug, the last thing I'll add before we progress to the next slide is on that last point. This is particularly important for people who have never managed before, right? So it's not just people who are new to the organization, it's also people who are new to being managers. Because there are 2 things that can happen in that particular pivot point in somebody's career. One would be they could potentially be being promoted to manage friends, people who were formerly their colleagues, their peers inside the organization, which can always be tricky. And you need to give them support and tools to be able to navigate that transition. And then the second is they may very well have been promoted because they were really good at the job they were doing before and not because they have any experience or capacity to manage. And so getting at those folks as they are developing their management skills, that is a opportunity to embed the kind of behaviors that you want to see from them.
Yeah, I think the managing friends point, Erica, is a great point. And some things too, going beyond these top 3 points, we're seeing some initial trends as well from some honorees in that less than a third are slowly adopting it, and that completion of this training is actually a factor in the performance review process. So I had mentioned accountability in that first point. We're seeing a slow uptick in the number of organizations who are actually holding managers accountable by including it in performance evaluations. So something that's a developing trend with respect to how this training is being done. And then also we're seeing some knowledge assessments. Slightly less than half the honorees throughout 2018 indicated they quiz their managers on the topics contained in this training, separate from the training itself. So again, some other underlying trends that we're seeing develop. It's not adopted by the majority of honorees at this point, but something we're certainly keeping our eyes on.
Yeah, for sure. Excuse me. So Chelsea, if we can go ahead and hop ahead to the next slide. This is another thing that we are seeing in terms of available channels to report misconduct. So if you think back to the slide where we showed you what people are actually using, these are the channels that people are indicating they are making available to their employees. And we had a question come in from the floor on the usefulness and effectiveness of an ombudsman program. About 27% of the data set uses that particular kind of reporting modality. Again, it's a person, which is the preferred way for people to raise concerns. They want to go talk to someone. And so, to the extent that it's a feasible approach for your organization, it's certainly something we are seeing a good chunk of the data set employ.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And Erica, speaking of these various resources to report misconduct, one thing that we touched on before is the variety of tools and resources made available to employees is of course important, but keep the previous slide in mind in that the majority of individuals making reports want to talk to another human being. They want to get their questions answered. They want to talk to a person, right? So it's when thinking about resource allocation in your own program, be cognizant of where your employees are actually going to versus where you're putting your dollars and your spend.
Yep, absolutely. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Chelsea, if we can go ahead and advance to the next slide. The next thing that Doug and I wanted to talk about was what happens when you get that concern or that complaint. So we talked about the ways in which employees are reporting. We talked about the ways we're training managers to deal with those reports. We talked about the ways in which those things are coming in. One of the interesting things to us has been looking closely at what is actually happening with those investigations. And part of this is, we see a lot of really interesting statistics in the culture data set around organizational justice and looking at faith in the investigation system and happiness with how the process went. And so one of the things we did inside of our BELLA organization, the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, is we did some survey work of the BELLA community on the ways they're looking at root cause analysis and the ways in which they're training investigators. And one of the things we found is half of that data set indicated that investigators that conduct investigations across the business are all trained in their own way. So HR handles their investigations, Health and Safety handles their investigations, Loss Prevention handles their investigations, IT handles their investigations, and then compliance trains their investigators. And only 33% of the data set is training investigators using the same protocol in order to guide their investigation process so that there can be some consistency across experience. Because, as you guys know, when a concern comes into the system, if the concern says, I don't feel like Erica likes me, it's going to go to HR, right? If Doug complains about me, it's going to go to human resources. If Doug complains about me because of a protected characteristic, it's often going to go to compliance in that perspective. And if my experience is drastically different, depending on which of those two routes it takes, it undermines faith in the process and it undermines your ability as a compliance officer to really understand what the trends look like and what the data looks like. And so, this is a very interesting place where we're watching companies improve their programs by looking at some of this plumbing, if you will, but, underpinning one of the key things that the compliance function does. Doug, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Nothing substantively, Erica, but just to point out for the audience, this is from our root cause study Ethisphere conducted earlier this year with the BELLA community. Again, a reference to the fact that we'll be pulling in many different data sets throughout the conversation today.
Yep. And then we did get a good question that came in, Doug, on whether we think that companies, or whether we see that companies are moving in the direction of mobile or text reporting in order to cater to the millennial workforce. And, we have seen a little bit of an increase in that. It's not dramatic. And I will be really curious to see whether the inclination to talk to a person is actually that different amongst the incoming millennial workforce, or if the millennials don't like to talk to people, they want to chat things, turns out to be true, right? There's been a lot of conversation about all the things that the millennial generation will change from a reporting perspective. My suspicion, quite honestly, is that people are still going to want to talk to people, but we'll see, right? We'll see. It's the technology is certainly there for those who are interested in implementing it.
Yeah, to put some data behind that, Erica, we've seen over the last 2 years a jump from about 12 organizations that reported using an app-based system for reporting to about 20% to 2018. So again, it's a minority. It is growing, but it is still a minority. And to your point, Erica, it's what I find curious to see is in the adoption of these, mobile-based reporting apps or ways to interact with compliance to get your questions answered. What technologies will be used? Famously, Accenture released that Kobe platform with which there's I think it's a chatbot, if I'm not mistaken, that allows you to interact with the code and ask essentially a robot questions specific to the code. And as we're seeing companies slowly roll out these solutions, I think we're just now getting a sense of the data on how it's being used, if it's effective, and really the general comfort level with employees in engaging with these sort of platforms. So again, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the one thing that I would say on that point though, Doug, is the difference to me between the chatbot, and for those of you who are Bella members and you missed the webcast we did on what Accenture has done, that's on the Bella resource site. You can listen to the recording. But what they basically did is they built a chatbot for their code of conduct, and the engagement level with it has been phenomenal. Tens of thousands of questions that have come into the chatbot about specific code-related questions. Well, some of them are people trying to break the bot, but there are a lot of specific code-related questions. What they're not getting is they're not getting questions, concerns, or reports, right? This is point me to the gifts and entertainment policy. Can I take somebody to dinner? A vendor wants to pay for my cab in Russia. What should I do? Do I need to do anything specific when I'm traveling to India? Those kinds of questions are coming in. And I think the adoption on that technology is going to be phenomenal, right? I think there's going to be a lot of people of all generations that will find that to be a tremendously valuable way to get information, because it's consistent with the way we get information in the rest of our lives, right? We have a question, we ask Google. The question that the thing that I think is going to be interesting, the distinction I'd make is, if I have a concern about a colleague's behavior, if I have a concern about an offer a vendor made, if I have an issue to raise, is that going to go in through is that going to end up coming in through a chatbot, or am I still going to want to talk to a person about that? And my suspicion is that just from a psychological perspective, we're still going to see people wanting to go to people.
Yep, I don't disagree. Yeah, it's a great point.
Yeah. Okay, hopping forward in the interest of time, and talking a little bit about how people are handling the post-investigation process. So a couple years ago, we added a question to the EQ survey on the ways in which you as an organization are looking to protect people who have raised a concern. This was driven in part by some of the data that we had seen on the number of employees who said they experienced retaliation after raising an issue. And as you all know, experiences of retaliation are incredibly corrosive to the willingness that people have to ask a question or raise a concern. And so we added this question to the EQ survey, and what you see here is the 2-year trending data between 2016 and 2018 on what people are doing. And the thing that's interesting to me is the steps that people are taking that indicate a growing relationship with human resources, so that you can, for example, monitor people during times of layoffs or restructurings to make sure that you're not impacting someone who had raised a concern or had been a witness in an investigation of alleged misconduct. Not that you can't still move forward with that, but just that you want to know that that is happening. Similarly, monitoring whether the reporting individual has had a change in job status, has their performance evaluation been impacted, looking at changes in job assignments, and then my personal favorite, monitoring sick day usage. Because if you see trends that change, indications that somebody is absent from the office more than they used to be, that is an indication that there's potentially something going on in that particular individual's work environment that would cause them to be experiencing challenges.
Yeah, and for this question too, Erica, for those in attendance today, you can see that across just about every dynamic, these percentages have increased, right? I think that's indicative of just a broader investment in these areas across all companies, and realizing the importance of making sure that there is adequate protections in place for those who report suspected misconduct.
And then on the transparency side, this is another one that we're seeing a lot of organizations look at very, very closely. We've been tracking the organizational justice numbers inside of our culture survey, and that's one of the areas that companies have a tendency to struggle with, right? You raise a concern, you raise a question, it goes into the black box, you're told the company's looking into it, and you never see anything or hear anything about what actually happened. And you start to question, right? Are the rules the same for everyone? Did the company actually conduct an investigation? Did they do anything about my concern? And so we're seeing companies try to the extent that they can, while still balancing the privacy concerns and expectations around it. We're seeing many companies try to make that black box a little bit more gray, and to share statistics, to share how long an investigation traditionally takes. So if you have a 60-day close rate, or a 90-day close, whatever the case may be, investigations by topic type, things along those lines, just ways of sharing with a broader cross-section of the company what actually happens in the investigation process. So for many years, as you can see, starting in 2016, people were circulating this to senior leaders. They've been circulating it to the board for considerably longer, but it sort of went from, we're going to tell the board about that. Okay, we'll tell the board and senior leadership about that. Okay, we'll tell the board, senior leadership, and the management team, lower level management team about that. And now we see a full third that are saying, we tell our employees, we share this information with our employees, and try to be as transparent as we can. And then a subset of that third is making that information available to the public, either as a standalone report or as part of their CSR reporting. And that one's interesting to me, but because the piece of that that's interesting to me is the fact that the CSR report is growing, right? We've gone from 11% to 23%. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that once you tell your employees, you might as well tell the world, right? Because the chances are that somebody in your organization is going to wind up sharing that information with someone, and you might as well control that particular channel.
Yeah, to really hammer home this point too, Erica, regarding why this building trust component is so important, in at least our eyes, is the fact that when looking at Ethisphere's culture quotient data, a third of the employees that we've surveyed say they do not agree that the rules and disciplinary actions are the same for all the employees in the organization. That's a full third. And furthermore, a quarter of employees that we've surveyed don't agree that the disciplinary actions that are taken, or rather, if actions are taken when someone does engage in misconduct. So again, a third don't believe the rules apply equally to everyone, and a quarter don't believe actions are even taken. So the importance of making sure that this trust is developed by transparently articulating to the employee population what does happen in the event of report is fundamental to make sure that the folks involved are confident in the future and coming forward and getting their questions answered and making those reports.
So Doug, in the interest of time, I know you and I could spend the next 4 days talking about this. Let's go ahead and jump to the next section, which is kind of building on some of the stuff that Doug and I have already been talking about, and that is this idea of the ways in which leading companies are measuring their existing culture and the ways in which they are moving it forward for their employee base. So some of the different things that we're seeing in the data set that are indicative of the various ways in which companies are measuring culture. So if we can just jump straight into the data on this. This is one where we're seeing more and more companies add more ways that they're measuring culture, and that they're being systematic about it. So what you see here in front of you is the year-over-year change since 2016. We've gone from 5 ways typically to measure culture to 6. And the one that's being added the most is that I find most interesting. The one that's being added is the physical site visit. And I think this is indicative of the growing recognition on the part of compliance officers that the relationship with internal audit is one that you can leverage, right? Your audit team is out in the field. Leverage those folks and give them questions that they can ask that provide you with feedback. Now, the important thing here, the important thing on all of these is that the feedback is coming into the compliance function, right? So it's not just that HR is running an engagement survey. It's that HR is running an engagement survey and you can do something with that information. You can send, you've sent your audit team out to get data. You can do something with that information. The social media piece is the other one that we have seen that has been growing tremendously. And I think this is 2 things. One is increasingly your employees and others are sharing feedback on their experience with your company on social media. So whether it is somebody hopping on Twitter and complaining about a experience with one of your employees, or an employee leaving a Glassdoor review, or some of those other things that are out there, the ways in which employees are sharing their experience with the company, the way in which customers are sharing their experience with the company. Those tools have expanded dramatically over the course of the last couple of years. And correspondingly, the tools that companies can use to monitor their social media mentions are also increasing dramatically. So I am fairly confident that for the vast majority of you on the phone, if you have a corporate Twitter handle, you have somebody that is responsible for managing that handle, for actually tweeting on behalf of the company, and also for monitoring what comes back at you in terms of mentions. And you, as the compliance officer, can use some of that tracking and trending information as part of your overall review of what the culture looks like across the business. So if you have a spike in a particular business unit that is having customer experiences that are engendering feedback on social media, not saying that you're going to light the house on fire because of that, but it becomes something that you can utilize as part of your analysis. It's a piece of the puzzle, and it's part of the data that comes into things when you are looking at stuff. We got a great question that came in from the floor on what kinds of questions do we see companies asking the audit team to ask. And it really varies by company, but we've seen companies asking their audit team to ask questions about awareness of resources and guidance. So, hey, you're going to be out doing an anti-corruption audit. Can you ask the people you're talking to if they know how to find the policy? What do they think of it? Do they understand the guidance that's given to them in that policy? Do they feel like they, know how to raise a concern? When you're talking to folks in a particular location, you're in a manufacturing facility, do you ever see the hotline posters? Are they hung anywhere? Do people understand? Do you get the sense in talking to people that they understand how to raise questions? Those are the kinds of things that you can get a sense of when you're out in the field as an audit team member, and then you can share that with the compliance team. Doug, I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to that.
Nope, I think you covered it very well.
Okay, perfect.
But this does lead us to what companies are measuring and to what are they seeing? What are they finding as part of this analysis? We've pulled, again, a high-level view of what Ethisphere is seeing with respect to its own culture data set. And to give an example of sort of the insights that companies are getting by engaging in this culture measurement effort. And quite consistently across many organizations that we've seen, awareness and the perception of the program as a whole is viewed quite favorably. And as we like to always say, Erica, this is a testament to, again, much like the folks on the phone, the efforts put in by the compliance team in ensuring that the program is well communicated, well resourced, well articulated, and made available to those folks across the enterprise. So again, very high scoring divisions. And for a little bit of context as well, what we're looking at, the percentages represent the proportion of the favorable responses to all responses in our data set. So you can view this as, for awareness of the program and resources, just about 90% of the input we receive for this particular section of our culture assessment process is viewed favorably across the respondent base. So on the left, we have our 4 highest performing pillars across that cultural data set. And on the right are the bottom performing. We had alluded to organizational justice back on building trust through transparency, and this is a great example of why we hammer home this point. It's among our lowest, or it is the lowest scoring pillar across all the areas that we look at within Ethisphere anyway. And again, establishing trust through transparency is the reason why. With a 68%, we tend to focus on that very much. And going back earlier into the presentation regarding training managers on their ethics and compliance responsibilities, we see that nearly a quarter of respondents do not view the perceptions of their managers favorably. And so again, this is a very key component of why measuring culture is so important.
Great. Thank you, Doug. And for those of you who are interested in a little bit more on the culture piece of things in particular, Doug and I will actually be doing a webinar in June on what we see in our culture data set. We're also going to be coming out with a variety of different things from a written perspective over the course of the next couple of months. The N on our data set is at a place now where we feel like we can do some really meaningful trending, including by industry sector. So stay tuned for a lot more on that. And if you'd like to join us in June for that conversation, that is up on the events page at ethisphere.com. So Chelsea, if we can go ahead and hop ahead to the next slide. So sort of which tools are honorees using, companies in the data set using in order to do some of this survey work? What do we see as the difference in terms of response rates between those companies that do a culture survey and those that do an engagement survey? So for those, just to give you guys a bit of context, we differentiate between a culture survey and an engagement survey, both in the EQ questions and in the way that we think about things here at Ethisphere. So an engagement survey is traditionally run by human resources. Sometimes there are some good questions that you can use as an ethics and compliance professional from that survey. Sometimes there aren't. It really depends on which survey you're doing and how much flexibility you have to be able to add questions to that. You can usually get a little bit of a sense of what people think of the leadership team, a sense of what they think of their managers, but a traditional engagement survey is focused on markers of engagement, how you feel about your pay, how you feel about your benefits, how you feel about the company as a place to advance your career, and less on, will you tell us when something's gone wrong, and does your manager talk about the importance of ethics and integrity? So that's a little bit on the difference. 65% of the honoree data set uses a standalone culture survey. It's the 6th most common mechanism to measure culture in the data set this year. And we see some really significant differences between the way in which companies are running their culture surveys versus their engagement surveys and the corresponding response rates. So Doug, I know you live the corresponding response rate world, so you've got a lot of thoughts on this, so I'll ask you to step in here.
Yeah, and the reason why we look at this is really we've discovered that how you measure culture does in fact matter. And if you look towards the right, we found that 60% of those organizations that choose to run a survey dedicated to measuring ethical culture within their organizations do so with the assistance of a third-party provider versus 91% for those who engage in an engagement survey. Quite a difference. So that external support is more often provided to those folks engaging in a broader HR engagement survey when compared to a culture survey, which, at the surface might mean a few different things, but when we dial into the implications of that, we're finding a little bit of bifurcation between the two processes with respect to output. The bottom percentages are one such example. So nearly 80% of those organizations running an engagement survey achieve a response rate of of at least 70%. So of the populations identified to take their engagement survey, a pretty strong majority achieve at least a 70% response rate. Contrast that against 40% of those who do an ethical culture survey of at least 70%. So quite a difference. Almost twice as many surveys done from the engagement perspective receive that 70% minimum response rate. Quite a difference. And exploring why that might be, we've posited within Ethisphere that there's a few different factors at play with regards to why that response rate, or at least the percentage of response rates received, could differ. We find that one driving cause that we're exploring is the fact that when surveys are run within an organization internally, you lose that ability to position the survey as being done by an objective third party outside the organization and allow those folks who take it to remain anonymous in the process. So that lack of anonymity in reporting, we think, is one contributing factor. Compliance professionals generally aren't survey experts. So there might be some lack of support that compliance is receiving when administering a culture survey, which may result in a lower response rate, but many different factors at play with respect to these two different surveys. And again, why we think this matters, Chelsea, if we can move to the next slide, we're seeing those folks that do take the time to measure using a dedicated survey are covering a much broader array of relevant topics, at least from an ethical culture perspective, versus those who do engagement. So there's quite a bit of data in front of you at this point. The key takeaway here is the difference for the green bar versus the gray bar. The green bar being the percentage of honorees who did in fact cover that given topic in their culture survey versus those who do so in the engagement survey. So again, it's quite apparent that those who embark on a survey dedicated to measuring culture are coming away with more actionable data, more insights specific to, again, acting on whether or not the organization has an ethical culture.
Right. Yep. Exactly. And this makes sense. If you step back and think about it, the things that a traditional HR-based engagement survey are going to be concerned about are different than the things that you should be concerned about as a compliance officer. And so that's honestly part of the reason why we started doing the culture survey work. Is we had a number of people in our community, in the Bella community, who asked us to take this on, and we've now been doing the culture survey work we've got it in 29 languages at this point, which again allows us to survey in native language. That also doesn't always happen when you run a survey internally. You don't always take the time to translate it. And so, thinking through your survey process and the opportunity that this data might allow you, or that you might be able to utilize this data to be able to really drill down into the places where you have significant challenges with awareness of compliance resources, for example, or perception of the company's commitment to non-retaliation, things along those lines. Mm-hmm. So Doug, if we want to go ahead and hop ahead to the next slide. We've got a couple minutes left. Doug and I will stay here for as long as you guys can. we spend all day talking about this, but I know that some of you probably have other obligations at the top of the hour. So we will keep talking. Again, we're going to send the recording to anybody who can't stay past the top of the hour, along with the slides and the report that underpins this particular analysis. But I want to make sure that I don't give short shrift to the board component of this, because this is another place that we saw really interesting data trends. But before I leave the survey piece for a second, I am going to answer one question that came in from the floor. We've gotten some great questions, and if we can't get to them all, we will answer them in email. But one question that did come in is, should you include ethical culture questions in your engagement survey? And the answer to that is, unfortunately, it depends. I have never seen a company get more than 8 ethical culture questions into an existing engagement survey. It's often very hard to do that in a meaningful way without making the survey way too long, and then the length of the survey impacts your response rate. So if you're rolling out an engagement survey, your organization has survey fatigue, you can't get a culture survey out separate from the engagement survey, then by all means get those questions in if you can. The challenge you're going to have is the existing length of the engagement survey. So, right. So that's really the issue you're going to run into there.
And Erica, too, on that point, be cognizant if going that approach where your ethical culture questions lie within that survey. Yes. We've heard anecdotally a few horror stories of slotting in those questions that compliance wanted right after the compensation-based questions in the survey. Mm-hmm. So sort of if you think or put yourself in the shoes of the employee, they've just been, had to comment about their perceptions of their compensation and then transition right into an ethical kind of culture question mindset, can skew the results, I'll put it. Making sure that you position the questions in a way within the survey that makes sense, and you won't be subjected to previous questions biases, if you will, is very important. So just be aware if that is the approach, or within your organization that's the situation you find yourself in, make sure that you're aware of where those questions you land from that survey.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few words on engaging your board, because this is another place where we have seen a tremendous level of change from a year-over-year data perspective. Chelsea, if we can jump ahead to the next slide, we are seeing companies increasingly look at the ways in which they can more meaningfully expose their independent directors, so non-management directors, to the company's operations. We've seen a steady growth in the number of companies that are rotating the location of either annually rotating meeting locations, so taking the board out of headquarters and having the meeting someplace else that the company has operations. Obviously, that doesn't work for every company. There are a lot of companies that don't have other places they can hold meetings, but to the extent that is applicable to your organization, rotating your board around so that they see something other than headquarters every time is one thing that we're seeing companies look very strongly at. And then other mechanisms to allow directors access to company facilities if they, as they move around the world. So Larry Fink, years and years ago at a conference, he's the CEO of BlackRock. I heard him mention the fact that they give all BlackRock independent directors key cards to the offices. And so they can go in and into any office anywhere in the world. If they happen to be, in that particular city, they can walk into the building like any other employee. And they can, grab a conference room and chat with people and do whatever else they need to do. And that transparency is really important to the point that Fink made was that transparency is really important because you want the directors to have a good understanding of the risks and the operations of the business. One of the best ways to do that is to actually let them see it. And so whether it's manufacturing plant tours or, one of the things we're seeing a lot of companies think about, are there key customers or other third parties in our value chain that a director should be exposed to? So bringing in a couple of key suppliers, bringing in a couple of key clients while the board is in town, having them at lunch, things along those lines, bringing them in for coffee, letting directors ask questions. But, so that's something we're seeing a lot of, something that we think is a good trend to make sure that directors feel like they are empowered and have the necessary information to effectively oversee risk. We hop to the next slide, talk a little bit about what you talk to your directors about. So we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of companies that are talking to the board about a lot of different things. And 87% of honorees that are communicating with the board at least once a quarter, basically as often as and usually this is not the full board, this is the committee that oversees the program, talking to them at least as often as they meet. Increasingly, we see situations where the chief ethics and compliance officer has a pre-meeting with the chair of the audit committee or whatever committee oversees the program. They have a conversation about, sort of an overview of where things are at, what's going to be talked about at the committee level, things along those lines. 94% of honorees are talking to the board about the results of a culture survey, talking to the board about what they see in their ethical culture measurement activities. So whether it's site visits or any of the other things we talked about, talking about risk assessment, talking about risks. We got a great question that came in as part of the questions as people were registering, asking about how do I make my audit committee conversation more of a discussion and less of a narrative? And that is I think the keystone of all of these conversations that we're having with people about on the governance side, which is how do I help my directors understand what good looks like so that I can have a dialogue that is challenging to what I'm doing with my program. And this in part goes to this question of, what else are you doing to expose directors to the business as a whole? But we're seeing companies, for example, tie their presentations to key risk areas, tie their presentations to the rhythm of the business. So if you have the opportunity to have a broader conversation once in the year with the committee about what you're planning on doing with the program, and then the conversation becomes one around what you've learned. And if your directors are not engaging, then it's an opportunity to step back and ask yourself, why? Are you inundating them with data? Is there an opportunity to tell a story? Is there an opportunity to make it more of a narrative? So, so those are some of the things that we're seeing on the conversation with the board side of things. Doug, I'll pause my run briefly there and see if there's anything else that you would add to that before I jump into the next slide.
Yeah, it's Erica, I'd say you covered just about everything. The one point from data side that I found interesting is that 87% of program owners who do engage the board at least quarterly has remained almost unchanged for several years. So that strong majority at that frequency is something we've seen time and time again as we've continued to refine and update the survey. So just one sort of bit of data context to provide in light of the conversation.
Absolutely. And so then the last thing I wanted to highlight for you all, and this is something that we are particularly proud of, is the difference between the percentage of honoree companies that have at least over 20% of their board made up of women, outpaces every other marker. And so there's been a ton of research that has been done on the importance of diversity and what diversity brings to the table from a business perspective. There's a lot of dialogue around how to increase the diversity of both the management team and the board. And what we see amongst the honoree community is that 24% of honoree companies, the majority of honoree companies rather, have at least 24% of their board made up of women. So that's actually the average, which means that there are some that are even higher than that, which is great. You know, and I think that's something that we are going to see, you know, continue and continue to grow. And to go all the way back to that stock slide, I would posit that this is part of the reason, one of the causation components underlying that correlation of world's most ethical companies consistently outperforming the other similarly weighted indices, because this is consistent with the research on the business case behind having a diverse board. So with that, let's hop to the last slide, which just covers a handful of questions that we got in advance. And then Doug and I will take a couple of the questions from the floor. Before more of you have to drop, and thank you to those that are hanging in, before more of you have to drop, the one question that did come in from the floor, Doug, that I will throw over to you is, what's our timing on 2019 WME, and what should people keep an eye out for if they're interested in engaging with us on the data?
Yeah, so for the 2019 World's Most Ethical Companies process, we're trying to adhere to a calendar similar to 2018 in that we'll be releasing the 2019 Ethics Quotient Survey and application materials late this summer, most likely July, with a webinar to follow in August that will detail all the changes made year over year to the process, as well as more information from our team on how to apply and navigate the application process and so on. So as you all know, that this is a process that we update and revise every year. We collect a considerable amount of feedback from participants, subject matter experts, and we observe ourselves changes in regulation and best practices across the space, and make the necessary edits to the process to make sure that we're in fact covering those data points that are relevant and really reflect best practice. So as we make those edits throughout the summer, we'll again be releasing more information on the application in late July.
Great, thanks, Doug. So I'm going to take at least a couple of questions here, and you know, still try to my best to be as respectful as possible of everybody's time. Doug, I'm going to throw the second bullet here over to you, which is, how often are board members being asked to take training or certified at the Code of Conduct? Do you have thoughts on that from a data perspective?
I do. Unfortunately, it's not going to be very satisfying, because the answer is it depends. It depends upon how the board education, or rather the training, is structured, and if it's certifying the code, what form does that code take. We can provide some additional information after the presentation, but it really depends upon the nature of the board's relationship with compliance and how that's structured overall. Yeah. So again, it's the unsatisfactory answer of it really depends.
And there's some sector breakdowns here that are interesting, right, too. You know, industry trends. The one thing I can tell you is that board members are not being asked to do it any more often than employees. That's right. That one's for sure. And it is either usually on the same schedule as employees or less frequently. And again, as I said, that it really varies depending on the industry that you're talking about. Some sectors are more frequent than others. From Ethisphere's perspective, as we look at the regulatory expectations, you know, at a minimum, making sure that the board is exposed to training, that they understand what the employees are seeing. I've had a number of directors tell me that they actually want to take the employee course so that they understand. These are folks who have responsibility for overseeing the program, so they're on the audit committee or a similar committee. They actually want to see it. They want to see the code of conduct. They want to see the training, because that's one of the ways that they understand what employees are seeing. So, you know, certainly that's an important dialogue to have with your audit committee chair. Yeah. Third question that we get in. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to ask you the third question of how important do you believe the ethics, compliance, and human resources integration interaction is between the two groups?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. And the answer to this, I think, is at the heart of a lot of the interesting trends that we see in the data. Look, at the end of the day, human resources is engaged in people support, and ethics and compliance is engaged in mitigating people-created risk. And so it's an incredibly important partnership. It's also, for many organizations, an incredibly challenging relationship, right? I have heard stories of turf battles that are just astonishing between human resources and the ethics function. And so it's figuring out how to navigate that relationship successfully and to the betterment of the organization as a whole and to both functions is critically important. But I'm not going to tell you it's easy by any stretch of the imagination based on what we have seen from other organizations. So critically important, also tremendously challenging. Not always. If you're one of the ones on the line that has a great relationship with human resources, count yourself very lucky.
Yeah, I would agree.
So Doug, let's take one from the floor that's not on the slide, and then everybody else that we didn't have a chance to take their questions, let's we'll make sure to follow up. One of the questions that we got from the floor, Doug, that we didn't have a chance to take while we were working through the data itself is the best practices from the perspective of a reporting line. So to go back to the idea of a hotline, do we have any thoughts? Do we have any opinion on do companies have one hotline that's managed by the compliance function? Do companies also have an HR related hotline? Do they have two lines? Do we recommend a centralized mechanism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's this goes back to the it depends scenario. It really depends upon the nature and structure of your operations worldwide. So to provide a little bit of context, as part of our culture survey efforts, we allow organizations to interject within the question set, all the different methods that they perhaps collect responses and questions from. We've had organizations include up to 20 different methods that they, have included ways in which they receive reports. That includes several different hotlines across many different jurisdictions and function groups. And by all accounts, my biggest concern when looking at that data is, where's it all going on the back end? Is it being aggregated appropriately? Who's reviewing it? Is there anyone within the organization that's looking at things broadly and able to see where the broader trends may lie? Of course, the risk in having more hotlines, whether it be two or multiple, which we have seen before, is, are you losing the broader picture with what's happening? Are there certain jurisdictions or groups that are getting similar questions being reported? And if so, is there something more systemic at play? So that's really the risk that we see in that. But again, it depends upon the nature of your operations and whether or not that system is appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Doug. I would agree with that. I'm less concerned about who runs the specific hotlines and more concerned about where that information goes on the backside, right? At the end of the day, if you have multiple mechanisms by which you can collect feedback from your employees, I think that's only positive, provided that they're being utilized. But the caveat to that is you've got to have all of that information going to one central location. And the existing challenge, even setting aside the hotline, is there are still a lot of companies out there where you've got 4 or 5 different case management systems being utilized. You've got one in HR, you've got one that's being used by the compliance function that's tied to the Sarbanes-Oxley related hotline. You've got one that perhaps is being managed by health and safety. You've got one potentially being managed by quality. You've potentially got one being managed by loss prevention. And maybe you've got a litigation case management related system, depending on how robust your litigation group might be. And all of those systems have data that is important for you as the ethics and compliance officer to be able to understand what's happening across the business. And if you don't have your arms around those pieces, then it doesn't really matter who's managing your hotline because you're not able to holistically look at what's coming in on the backside. So if you have to pick a fight, the fight would be getting a view of all of that data as opposed to who is going to manage the hotline itself.
Yeah, and then don't forget what we talked about previously in that, most of your questions are probably going to your management and not to your hotline. So don't forget, I mean, to focus on those areas in which, you know, those questions are coming primarily.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So Erica, instead of going to the slide questions, I'd like to pose to you one of the other questions we received from the panel, or rather the group earlier today, in that going back to reporting and retaliation, this individual asked, due to fear of retaliation, in this particular individual's organization, most employees don't speak up. Other than training managers, do we have any thoughts or suggestions on really developing that speak up culture within organizations? Do you have any thoughts or examples?
Yeah, that is a topic for its own standalone hour-long webinar.
yeah, probably some envy on that one, but yeah.
Yeah, you know, and I mean, look, the bottom line is the two primary reasons based on our data that people don't speak up are fear of retaliation and the belief that nothing will happen.
Right.
And if you look at what people actually say they are experiencing when they indicate they experience retaliation, the bulk of it is not what the lawyers would consider to be retaliation, right? It's not tangible employment action. It's something else. It's I got pulled off the good projects. I got pulled off the good clients. My work schedule was changed. My coworkers aren't inviting me to meetings anymore. People are looking at me funny. Mm-hmm. All of that is your manager, right? So making sure that your manager understands what to do when an employee raises a question, and that you as the ethics and compliance officer are keeping an eye on that scenario, that's 90% of the battle. And then the rest of it, you know, is things that, you know, that you can look at in terms of, for example, one of my favorite ideas, the chair of the audit committee at one of the companies that I talked to earlier this year personally calls every employee that raises a concern. Mm-hmm. So they actually call every employee that raises a concern and they say, thank you. Thank you for raising the concern. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, right? And that, you know, simple act of thanking the employee can be tremendously impactful, right? We understand that this took courage. Thank you for bringing this up. We've seen companies take a person who was involved in uncovering a significant company issue and allow that person to do the annual code of conduct introduction video, as another example. So there are a ton of things that you can do to encourage a speak up culture, but your manager is still going to be the linchpin of making sure that any of that is effective.
Yeah, such a great example.
Well, thank you, Doug. Thank you to all of you, especially those of you who hung in with us a full 15 minutes past the top of the hour. As you guys can probably tell, Doug and I can talk about this all day long. And you know, twice on Sundays. So you know, we really appreciate it, and we hope we were able to get to some of the points that you were looking for out of all of this. We will follow up for those of you who asked questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. We'll go ahead and follow up with those, and then stay tuned both to our events page for other webcasts, and then also to the thought leadership that comes out through Ethisphere magazine, because we will write for the rest of the year off of what we have found that's interesting in this data. Until we go heads down and come up with next year and do the same thing again. So thank you for taking some time to join us today, and thank you to Doug for being my partner in crime on today's conversation.
And thank you, Erica, and thank you everyone for sticking around so long.